You're listening to episode 268 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Professor Richard Gombrich speaks with us about Buddhism in the modern world. Hi everyone. I wanted to thank so many of you who generously contributed to the Secular Buddhist Association this past year. As you know, this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any of the other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the Contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. The term living tradition may seem as much an oxymoron as, well, secular Buddhism. And yet, this organic vitality is a hallmark of Buddhism, even and perhaps especially today. There have been growing pains as Buddhism rubs up against and eventually becomes a part of each cultural context it encountered, but eventually Buddhism settled in. It's been an evolutionary tale, as new forms arise from the selective pressures of the environment, while older varieties may still flourish, or at least soldier on. Today is perhaps the greatest assault, as new ideas and cultures are pushing and pulling the tradition with unprecedented rapidity and variety. Richard Gombrich is the Emeritus Professor of Sanskrit at Oxford University and a member of the Oriental Institute and Balliol College. He is the founder and director of the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies and the general editor of the Clay Sanskrit Library. Before his retirement in 2004, he held the Bowden Chair of Sanskrit at Oxford University and a professorial fellowship at Balliol College for 28 years. He supervised nearly 50 theses on Buddhist topics and is the author of 200 publications. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Oxfordshire afternoon tea. Our guest today is Professor Richard Gombrich. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So very glad to have you with us today. And what I'd like to do is start by having you tell us about your background. How did you first come across Buddhism?
Well, in fits and starts and from different sources, really. My father, who came from Vienna and settled in England in 1936, although he first came to England briefly in 1935, but with the idea that he might settle, and he did settle in 1936. He had to go back in 36 in order to marry my mother, who was engaged at the time, and then he brought her over. And, of course, they came in the circumstances of the gathering threat of Nazi violence and the Second World War, which my father actually was very good at this sort of thing. Really, he saw the big picture in world news, and he was sure that this was the way that things were tending, and he thought that Britain was likely to be a safe haven. He didn't, like many of his friends and contemporaries, think it necessary to go all the way to America. They settled in England. At the end of the war, it wasn't really possible, I think, during the war, they took British nationality, and both my parents were very patriotic, very pro-British indeed. And later, my father did have the opportunity to go and settle in America, in particular when he was offered a chair in Harvard. And as the salary would have been about 3 times what he was earning in England, of course, it was a bit of a temptation, but he talked it over with my mother. And my mother said, no, we stay in England, and he was perfectly happy to do that. So my father and mother were in Britain and pro-British and liked being part of British society and British culture. But my father had always had very broad cultural interests. And I shouldn't stress the word cultural too much, because in fact he was also very interested in the natural sciences, but he'd never studied them. He took the Scientific American, for instance, regularly and read quite a lot of it, but he wasn't competent to read the more technical articles or really discuss most aspects of science. But he was very, very interested in science. And there were and I think I inherited this from him. He was interested in areas of human experience and endeavor which didn't really appeal to him personally. For instance, he was very, very, very uninterested in religion, which he took Voltaire's line on. He thought it was a load of rubbish, basically. But that didn't prevent him from being quite interested in learning what influence religion had had in the past and was still having on human beings. And in a way, that attitude to religion was the one that I imbibed from him. When I started becoming very interested in religion, it was very much in the spirit of a humanist and an atheist. Somebody says, why on earth do people have these very funny ideas and attitudes? This is so queer. We must go and have a look at it. A bit like being interested, you see, in rather spectacular fauna, animals who, however, one didn't think there was anything about them except that they were very, very interesting. And how come they got to be like that? Well, my father had this interest in human culture. He liked the statement of Horace that I don't think that anything human is alien to me. But that doesn't mean to say he really liked those things. It is that he wanted to find out about them. And one of the things was that he had, as a young man at university, although it had nothing to do with his own studies, he learned Chinese for a while and became very interested in and sympathetic to Chinese classical culture. And he always brought me up to think that the Chinese have had perhaps the greatest civilization in the world. Unfortunately, China has fallen on hard times and is in a terrible mess. But they have written wonderful poetry. They do absolutely wonderful painting, ceramics, and so on and so on. And they have had a large share of human wisdom. And he knew that a lot of Chinese were Buddhist. Of course, he also knew that the Buddha was not Chinese, but Indian. But he did, therefore, acquire a few books on Buddhism. I think they were all in German, though. And although I was brought up knowing some German, I could understand it well when my parents spoke it to each other. I never really used it, or to this day, I'm afraid, became really an expert in German. So he had, say, the translations of Karl Eugen Neumann of the Pali Canon. Not the whole canon, but Neumann did, I think, the Digha Nikaya and the Majjhima Nikaya. And so, whereas I think my parents would have been a bit alarmed if I'd shown a great interest in finding out more about Roman Catholicism, or Orthodox Judaism or something like that, because that was a bit too close to the bone, you see. They must have been afraid that I would get converted to one of those things if I'd taken them up. But when I showed an interest in Buddhism, that was perfectly fine. And he knew that the Buddha had some wonderful ideas. And of course, before the Second World War, he wrote his World History for Young Readers, and it was published in German, and he had a couple of pages on the Buddha there, which, considering that his knowledge was very, very superficial, was really very good indeed, because he got the main facts about the Buddha right, and that his principal teaching was the Four Noble Truths and the truth about suffering and its elimination. There was nothing, when he came to revise it many years later and sent it to me for revision, there was hardly anything, I felt, that hardly a word that had to be altered, although it was extremely brief. So that was one thing. And then there was my compulsory military service. And this was the first really important thing that got me to know a little more about Buddhism and take more interest in it. I was posted to West Germany. This was just before I was sent there just before the British troops stationed there became part of NATO, rather than the British Army over the Rhine, which it was what it was called in the Second World War. Anyway, we became not occupying forces, but allies, and I was posted to Hanover, and my father knew a very nice man who was the director of the Hanover Art Gallery. He had been taken prisoner in the war, he'd been a soldier compulsorily, but of course my father knew that that was not his choice, and said he knew him quite well, and he could be absolutely sure that this man had no trace in him of fascism or anti-Semitism. So this man invited me to his home, and then it turned out that his wife, who was also an ordinary German, had become Buddhist during the war. She was, of course, under great strain. Her husband was somewhere in a prison camp, and she had to, like all Germans, I mean, they were losing the war for much of the time and didn't have much to eat and so on. Things were hard. But somehow she found out about Buddhism, and her home was a meeting point for the very, very few Germans in the northern part of West Germany who consider themselves Buddhist. And they met there, perhaps once a month, and had meetings and read some Buddhist text in German and so on. And so when she heard from me that I had heard of Buddhism, and at that point I had just read also that very, very good mentor classic by E.A. Burt about the teachings of the Buddha. Again, a very small book, but a wonderful selection of important Buddhist texts, which I really made me feel very positive about Buddhism. They were so interesting and well chosen and well commented on. So when that happened, she said, "Oh yes, come along, you must learn some more." And that then led to the fact that when I got to Oxford, I actually decided to switch from classics. I'd entered on a scholarship in Latin and Greek, and as quite a few students did, I took the first half of the course in Latin and Greek and then decided to do something else. And I had that was anticipated because the two halves of the course were very different from each other. The first half was in language and literature, the second half in history and philosophy. And then at that point, I switched to Sanskrit, which was, when you switch like that, a 2.5-year course. And I did so partly, you mentioned just now that when we were talking that I perhaps also had an interest in languages, and that was the case. When I was at school, my best friend at school, whom I sat next to for a long time, 2 or 3 years, Michael Coulson, was a very, very bright student who was particularly interested in languages, and we were taught a tiny, tiny bit about comparative philology, so that I knew that Sanskrit was related to Latin and Greek, which I had studied by now to a very high standard. I didn't really, at this point, really think about Pali. And indeed, when you did the Sanskrit course at Oxford, you had what they call a subsidiary language. But the subsidiary language was only allotted about a quarter or perhaps 20% of your time. And the British system was that you studied for a long time without taking any formal examinations. And at the very end of your stay, you had a huge set of formal examinations. I think I had 10 or 11 3-hour papers to sit. But Pali was a very small part of that. And you were allowed, if you're a fairly bright student, to choose a special subject, an extra paper. And I chose Buddhism. And this is quite funny and quite notable. And the Board of Studies, who had to decide whether my subject was suitable, well, they can't very well say that Buddhism wouldn't be a suitable subject, but there was nobody at Oxford to teach it. There was nobody. And this went on, of course, for many years after the time I'm talking about. My stay at Oxford, I was an undergraduate at Oxford from 1957 to 1961. There was no such thing as religious studies. There was theology. It was a very traditional Christian syllabus. And you didn't learn at that time even about Judaism, let alone about any other religion. You just learned about Christianity, and you didn't learn much about Roman Catholicism either, because it was an Anglican syllabus. So they didn't have any. I mean, Buddhism, if you said to them Buddhism, they say, Buddhism, how do you spell it? You know, they had absolutely no knowledge whatsoever of it. They found somebody who was an assistant curator in the Museum of Eastern Art, who was quite a sort of colourful and enthusiastic youngish man. And he talked to me a couple of times about Buddhism. I can't say I followed very much of what he was saying, and I didn't think he did either. And then I had this amazing examination, a 3-hour examination. I was handed a question paper, and I'll never forget the shock and horror that I had when I read it, because I understood the first question. I don't remember now exactly what it was. I understood the first question, and there were another 11 or 12 questions, and I had no idea what they were about at all. It was sort of like, you know, compare Sautrantika Buddhism with Sarvastivada, or something like that. I thought, what's that? I had no idea. And I was supposed to write 4 essays in 3 hours. There was only one question I could answer, so I sat down and I answered that for 3 hours. And I got an A.
Congratulations.
That was rather encouraging. But the interesting part of that story, in a way, from a different angle, is that when I retired, which was mandatory when I reached the age of 67 in 2004, there was again no one employed by the University of Oxford to teach Buddhism. And that is, in a nutshell, is the answer to why I founded, with my own money, the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies, because it seemed to me so appalling that after all this time, half a century, really, nearly half a century, as an institution, Oxford had hardly moved on. In that period, I had supervised 50 graduate theses, most of them about Buddhism.
And yet no teacher.
But I was the only, and I was the teacher, but my official remit was that I was professor of Sanskrit. And actually, I didn't teach Buddhist. I might have taught Buddhist Sanskrit. I hardly did that, only a very tiny bit. I was interested much more in Theravada and Pali, which arose, I suppose, really from that lady in Hanover, who was very much a Theravada Buddhist. Yeah. And that was the kind of Buddhism I learnt about, and that stuck with me and has stuck with me to this day. And that is, as the world probably knows by now, my favorite kind of Buddhism, so to speak, and what I am interested in above all else. Although I hasten to add that I really am interested in every shape and form of Buddhism, and love to sit puzzling about, now how on earth did it get to that teaching of the Buddha? So that was quite a long road, wasn't it?
Well, one of your teachers, I'm wondering if we can just divert for a moment, is Walpole Rahula. And why don't you say just a bit about the Venerable and your time with him and how he affected your studies?
Well, Rahula was never my official teacher at all. This is quite typical of my biography. I mean, I owe much more in sort of a very kind of miscellaneous kind of way to my father, who, even when I got interested in Buddhism, wasn't interested in it at all, but was perfectly happy that I should be. He used to say, and of course he was no fool, he used to say, very, very occasionally, perhaps once a year, he made a remark about it, and he would say something, it's rather like Stoicism, isn't it, Richard? And of course there is a lot of similarity between Stoicism and the teaching of the Buddha. But anyway, in this case, my parents got a neighbor who had just arrived and settled in London. He was called Professor E.F.C. Ludowijk, and he was a Sri Lankan, what they call a burgher, a person of mixed European and Sri Lankan descent. He'd been professor of English at the University of Sri Lanka, then called the University of Ceylon, and was a very reputed intellectual. He had married a Hungarian lady who in the end was not all that happy to be living in Sri Lanka, cut off from the most of the culture and sort of things that she knew about. So they came and settled in Hampstead. And he became a neighbor, and my parents met him in that way and invited him round. The first time, not when I was there, but they just said, like to welcome him to the neighborhood, and they found out a bit about him. And when he heard that the son of the household was interested in Buddhism, he said, he should really meet my great friend, the Venerable Walpole Rahula. Of course, my parents had no idea who that was. But when I met Ludowijk, he said, Rahula has been spending the last few years, it was quite a few, I think it may have been 10 at that point, living in Paris, writing a PhD for the University of Paris, for the Sorbonne, and why don't you go and see him? Or that would be the way to meet him. So I simply did. I simply took a plane to be in Paris for 48 hours, and I went and met Rahula. And that was the beginning of a very long and influential relationship. But Rahula was never officially my teacher at all. But he was very, very kind to me, and we got on like a house on fire, really. And in later years, he used even to come and stay with me in my house in various places. He got to know my children when they were very small. He was very kind of granddad to them. I don't mean that he was there very much of the time, but I used to arrange, when he was in London, I would have, say, a weekly class with him, but just myself, because it was just the two of us at our own convenience. And incidentally, I think that his book, which was based on his original PhD thesis, The History of Buddhism in Ceylon, is an even finer book than is What the Buddha Taught, although, of course, it answers a completely different purpose. As you would expect, very few people have read it, and so it's quite a long book and a very learned book. But that's a wonderful work of scholarship which has not been superseded. I gradually discovered, of course, that although Rahula was tremendously liberal in the British broad sense of the term, in his general views, and certainly could say quite truthfully that he had very close Tamil friends and had had all his life and so on, he was a bit of a Sinhalese nationalist. And in the very last years, he never said anything to me, and I never directly said anything to him. But at one point, when the civil war had broken out, and he was saying, why are these Tamil fighting us? We are not anti-Tamil at all, and this is all a terrible mistake, and it shouldn't be like this. And he would cite such true facts, as, for instance, that the head of the police force of Sri Lanka was a Tamil, so how can they say we're anti-Tamil, and so on. I did write a long letter once pointing out, yes, there are these individual examples you can give. But if there was really no discrimination against Tamil, there would only be one army, And that would be a mixture of Sinhalese and Tamil soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, there's no suggestion that such a thing exists or could exist. So I didn't hide from him that I didn't really agree with him about that in that area. But we avoided talking about it on the whole. He took a great interest in my career, and he did a wonderful thing when I had written my first book, Precept and Practice, and it was my PhD thesis, and it was rapidly published. But before it was published, he actually, I think it was before, I'm not quite certain, but he went through the book page by page. He read the whole thing and gave me a sheaf of, 20, 30 pages of notes, commenting on things that you haven't, this is almost right, but not quite right. So on and so forth. He found one or two really serious mistakes, but very few. But anyway, he, really, I can claim that the book, seriously claim, and I have claimed on one occasion, that the book has his entire approval. I had to claim it because there was a Sinhalese intellectual who is actually still alive, though very old, who went round attacking colonialist anthropologists and all that sort of thing. He spent a lot of time in London, but he was based in Sri Lanka, but he gave lectures in England. I never went to one, and I think they were quite libelous. He was very ferocious. And I was on the list of everybody who'd written a book about Sri Lankan culture or religion. And, it was all Western propaganda, imperialist propaganda. But I could actually say, not that it would have made any difference, I suppose, that every word of this has been approved by the venerable Dr. Walter. So I felt in myself, in my conscience, extremely safe.
Let's shift a little bit. Folks who are listening to this podcast would probably view that secular Buddhism is perhaps one of many results of Buddhism's encounter with modernity. And I'm wondering why you think Buddhism is such a living tradition. What is it about Buddhism that makes it so alive and relevant to contemporary society?
Well, of course, not everybody agrees with you and me. It is alive, let alone relevant to modern society. And I'm not an uncritical friend of modernizing Buddhism. I think that one of the great things that the Buddha did in a way was that he half Protestantized religion, and he chose the right half. And that is that he said, if you are really interested in religion and think that what I've taught you is so important and correct, then you should devote your life to it. You cannot combine it with ordinary life, in particular with family life. After all, we mustn't forget that traditionally monks and nuns are not allowed to have any sexual activity at all. They're certainly not allowed to have wives or husbands and to beget children and so on. And the Buddha rightly saw, something quite obvious, of course, that only a minority in society can undertake that kind of role. Society wouldn't exist if too many people undertook the role. So there are people, the self-elected elite, if you like. The word elite has recently acquired unpleasant connotations, but it just means the chosen, of course. But these are self-chosen people who take Buddhism totally seriously. And I'm quite serious when I say that almost all through my life, whenever I think about it, though I don't think about this particular point all that often, I have thought I really sympathize with being a monk, and I could imagine that if my upbringing and early life had been different, I would have been happy to be a monk. I can't possibly switch to it now. My greatest joy comes, in fact, from family life, and I wouldn't give it up for anything. But I really sympathize, and I didn't particularly mean only with Buddhist monks, though I have great sympathy and even empathy with them, but even a Christian monk. I could imagine what it's like to be a monk, and I think that's very fine. And then it seems to me that if you are trying to follow these ideals in lay life, you have an awfully difficult road to tread. It's really difficult. This has exemplified itself in my own life, and especially in recent years, in something which I don't want to claim that people should be sorry for me about, but really about money. Because, again, this comes from my father. My father always exemplified for me and occasionally articulated the point of view that money is the most boring thing in the world. He always said, I just cannot understand what people find interesting about money. And he used to say things like this. He said, if we're in a restaurant and there are two people at a nearby table and they're deeply locked in conversation throughout the meal, you can bet they're talking about money. So he himself, it was very strange. He never did anything in his life but open one bank account into which all his money went. He never did anything else. He never bought a share or did anything in order to increase his money, to the despair of my rather practically minded daughter, his granddaughter. And once when he was already rather old, he had a negotiation coming up with his publisher about the new edition of his book, The Story of Art. And my daughter visited him just after it, and then she came out in despair and said, the terms that he's agreed to are completely absurd. How could he say yes to this proposal? And my father said, I said yes, because he loves money so much. Absolutely true story. Literally, word for word, true.
So this is a valid criticism, then, of how it would be challenging for contemporary Buddhists to truly live the Dharma in a way that is contiguous with the original message, because we don't necessarily live in that society. We're not all going to become monastics.
No, I think that there are real problems. And, of course, they don't only arise in Buddhism. Even Gandhi, with his great non-violence, it is not very widely understood that Gandhi did not say that you can't be a soldier in the Indian army, and that if you're a soldier, you may have to kill people. He didn't even go as far as the Quakers go, in fact, you see, where it said, well, you can act as an ambulance stretcher carrier or something like that. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it's much, much broader than that. But the Buddha did only set out really one set of ethics and one set of ideals. But in his society, if you were really to be a Buddhist, you took the robe. I think it's also a very fine thing in Buddhism, which doesn't apply, of course, to Christianity, that any time when you've taken the robe and you feel suddenly that, or gradually come to feel life is not for me, you can leave. In some Buddhist societies, probably in most, there is some social stigma attached to it, but you can leave. And it's quite clear that in ancient times, people could and did leave, and even leave and rejoin and leave and rejoin. It's only a story from a medieval period, but there's somebody, I've forgotten his name now, but there was somebody recorded in a story who left and rejoined 7 times. But it just makes he was rather indecisive, but it does make the point that these are different people, so to speak, and they've chosen to be different people.
So I'm wondering what aspect of Buddhism, idea or practice or person, that's fascinated you the most over the course of your studies?
Well, it's a mixture of believing in the ideals and admiring the Buddha personally. I mean, the Buddha was the most wonderful ethical teacher, and I think that Buddhist ethics are quite magnificent. And I think that they've got certain things right, which other ethical systems, even the Christian one, don't always have right. The great stress on non-violence, I think, is very, very, very important. And altogether, I think the 5 precepts are wonderful. We don't know whether they were entirely invented by the Buddha or not. And of course, the Jains have 4 of them identical, and Jainism is a little older than Buddhism, and they're not really quite unique to Buddhism. But of course, there's something much more important, and that is that the Buddha said that they apply to all people equally, whether you are high caste or low caste, male or female, young or old or whatever. And he was an ethical egalitarian at a time when this was absolutely revolutionary in the world, and I'm an ethical egalitarian too. And I think that we must judge everybody by the sort of person they are, that is, that they have made themselves. And I think that everything really hangs on what kind of aspirations they have. Of course, the Buddha said everything depends on your ethical intentions. And we have a proverb, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, which is also quite a wise proverb. But the Buddha wouldn't say, yes, I didn't say that you shouldn't then think through the means to carry out your intentions. And I think also that in Buddhist ethics, just as in the modern legal system, you can do something terrible, like sort of run somebody over without intending to do it, simply through carelessness. So negligence is part of the ethical of the negative ethical system and so on. But I think that Buddhist ethics are really magnificent, and they are entirely individualistic. They stress on the autonomy and absolute value of the individual. And after all, the Buddha said, and this is, as you know, basic to Buddhism as a religion, but it's an ethical point as well, I can't save you. You can only save yourself. Teacher is the one who points the way. And of course, he was right. And so the Buddha is actually saying to everybody, and I'm sure you would agree, grow up. He's saying, you can't. I'll tell you a nice little anecdote. Some people in your circles, no doubt, will have heard of a wonderful Sri Lankan Theravadian lay meditation teacher called Godwin Samararatna, who's now been dead a good 10 years. He's a really magnificent man. He worked in the Kandy Public Library, and he used to tell very nice little stories about running a meditation center in Sri Lanka, attended by both local people and people from the West, often Americans. And he said there are 2 great differences between the groups. One of them is that when Westerners find they can't make the progress that they want to make in meditation and indeed in other aspects of Buddhism too, they blame their parents. And he said, he starts laughing at this point. He said, how can you be absurd? He said, it never crosses the mind of a Sri Lankan person to blame their parents. It doesn't even occur to them that their parents could be to blame. So that was one thing. And the other thing, which is very charming, he said, when people didn't reach their goals in the meditation course, it was always like this, that the Westerners had failed because they were trying too hard. And the Sri Lankans had failed because they weren't trying hard enough. There's a lot of wisdom there.
I'm wondering if that would be a good segue for us to explore some of the challenges of contemporary society, like this attitude of Westerners, I think particularly Americans, that's fair. What do you think Buddhism has the most to offer that we might be a little bit challenged by in our highly individualistic society?
Well, I'm all for individualism, and I think that this is a very, very complex and huge subject. I favor individualism. But I think that Americans take it sometimes in a way which makes me laugh, rather than the way that Godwin Samaratna laughed. There was a case, and perhaps again you would remember the details, which I don't, but it was probably 20 years ago, when there was a prominent American Buddhist lady who wanted to set up a Bhikkhuni Sangha in America, and she had the names and addresses of a fair number of people who said they would be interested in joining. And she sent out a circular with a questionnaire saying, these are the rules in the Bhikkhuni Vinaya. I suppose she took the Theravada, I don't know, but I assume so. Please, so tick and cross according to which rules you think we should keep. And I do find that very absurd, I must say, because individualism shouldn't mean that you aren't prepared to accept the guidance and opinion of people whom, after due consideration, you think are better qualified to make these decisions than you are.
Yeah. It doesn't mean anything goes.
It doesn't mean anything goes, and it doesn't mean to say that you are necessarily the person best qualified to decide on all kinds of things. It's perfectly sensible sometimes to say, I regard so-and-so as an authority on this, whether it's something academic or something moral or whatever, and if necessary, I shall ask them what they think. But that I won't bother them too often. But I'm going to take their view as my guideline until I have extremely good reason not to.
It would be like learning a language and sending out a note saying, which words do you think we should just not use?
Or which grammatical rules should we not keep?
We don't like that one. It's uncomfortable. Let's just take a few of those notes out.
And unfortunately, mankind, as we all know, is very imperfect indeed. And you really don't have to go into subtleties to think, what has Buddhism got right? And at this very basic level, there's very little difference between Buddhism and Christianity. I mean, how many countries in the world at this moment are going on principles of nonviolence? I mean, it's deeply depressing, isn't it, that even where you get a Nobel Peace Prize winner like Aung San Suu Kyi, whom incidentally I used to know well when she lived in Oxford, and because her husband was a good friend of mine. I didn't get to know her as well as him, but still I got to know her fairly well. And she gets the Nobel Peace Prize, and now they're doing unspeakable things to the Muslim population of Burma. And also, and this of course usually goes with the violence, but it's very important in my mind, also telling terrible lies about them. And the Burmese have an official history, as all countries do to some extent, but they are really hot on their official history, that these Muslims arrived in Burma recently. And that is completely untrue. It may be true of a few individuals, of course, but those people in that part of the north coast of Burma, they have been there for about 200 years. They're not newcomers. They have just as much right in terms of long habitation as other people to be there. And this is done by somebody who's got a Nobel Peace Prize. And this is a country that considered itself kind of a leader of the Buddhist world. And we are the most thorough Theravada Buddhists, which they base largely on the fact that they have such a tradition of learning the Abhidhamma by heart. Though I don't think that, in my opinion, that necessarily makes them wonderfully moral people.
I've memorized a text, not I'm living what the message of my tradition might be.
And may I just say that one of the things that nowadays, when I teach Buddhism, and I think I must actually put this into print at one point, I keep on stressing to people that there are several quite different passages in the canon where the Buddha says, don't hang on to my words. They are nothing. All that matters is whether you get my message. And he says this again and again, and it's just ignored. And people, especially in traditional Buddhist societies, of course. that people are very, very keen on memorizing the words, and they haven't understood what it's about. The best example, of course, and I have published this somewhere, is about the famous simile of the raft, where the Buddha isn't saying ignore my message. He's just saying you don't need to take a memory of my precise words with you.
Right.
That's terribly important, and people haven't understood it. It's very sad that they haven't.
I've seen that used as a reason for people to, I don't need to practice anymore because this, and they use the excuse of, well, that would be carrying the raft with me. I'm like, that's maybe not quite the meaning intended there.
That text has been so widely abused and misunderstood. That's why it's part of my 3-week elementary course now to teach that test and say, what do these words mean in context? And I really don't think it's possible to argue with what I'm saying. It simply is like that. I got it very briefly at the end of chapter 1 of my book, How Buddhism Began, where I quote a really ludicrous Mahayana scripture, is Prajnaparamita, where they say, you know, neither do the Dhamma nor the non-Dhamma, and blah, 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 all kinds of sort of mystical claptrap, as if it was a meaningless paradox. When he says, you must understand what I say, let alone something I have never said. Adhamma, in that context, in the last sentence of the text, means Adhamma, what is not my teaching. He said, don't even cling on to the words of what I've said, let alone words I've never said.
I'm wondering, there's something that you brought up a few minutes ago about there are untruths or lies being stated. And I think sometimes that is a very intentional action. Sometimes I think there is misinformation. People inadvertently, they simply in innocent ignorance don't understand. I want to give some spaciousness to that possibility as well. But I'm wondering if one of the contributions that Buddhism might have, although there seems to be some problem in execution of this, is the idea of seeing things as they are. This idea of, through the practice, through the Dhamma, that we're not missing the main point here. We're really seeing things as they are, that true awareness. I'm wondering if you might speak to that for a moment. And is that a problem we're seeing?
I'm sorry, but I'm going to turn around and almost reprimand you for doing what I've just condemned, which is, fastening on particular words. I don't think that the phrase Yatha Bhutadasana, seeing things as they are, is of itself very valuable or helpful. We just got to think about what is meant here.
I completely agree. Yes.
It is not lying to yourself, isn't it?
Right.
It's being honest to yourself as much as to other people. And that is so, so important. That you've got to, as insofar, nobody can, unless they're very far on the way to enlightenment, to really always be totally honest with themselves. Our minds and our characters are much too complicated for that, but we can make a jolly good shot at it. And may I just say a couple more words about truthfulness? And
please, yes.
Firstly, you see, I think, and I published on this, though not in a particularly Buddhist context, I think that one of the great disasters of the modern world, for which we're all suffering and will go on suffering more and more, is that people have lost sight of the fact, what is education, when we mean education, really about? Fundamentally, what is the fundamental value and aim of education? And it is to be truthful, to try to get to the truth. And all the stuff about what they do to universities these days, and it's all about that you should get an education which enables you to get a lot of money,
right,
which is nauseating. But it's not that it's so awful in itself, but it just completely misses the point. And what education has to be about is getting to the truth. And getting to the truth is very largely a matter of how you interact with other people in the university who are committed to the same goal, both your teachers and your fellow students. So I am very, published and spoken very polemical things about modern education and about modern universities, because I think they're following a disastrous line, often at the behest of the government.
I would take it one step further and say it's not just missing the point, it's perverting the point, it's corrupting it.
Yes, but I mean, it's a very, very simple point indeed, that what matters is the truth. And nowadays, particularly because of recent events, the election of Trump and the disaster in Britain of Brexit and other disasters which seem about to follow and so on, we are seeing that being, how shall I say, passive, too flexible, not sufficiently alert about the need for the truth is leading us into horrible situations, which are costing millions of lives, not calling spades spades, and so on. And I'm reading articles, and no doubt you are too, in America, about the post-truth atmosphere in which we're living. And that the people who write these articles, which are often well-intentioned, have just discovered that people like to believe something that they would like to be true. And they are very lazy, to put it mildly, about following through to discover whether it really is true.
Right. Uncomfortable truths versus pleasant lies, pleasant fictions.
Yes, but I mean, after all, this really is the whole story of the Trump campaign. Never mind other things like the absolute vulgarity and so on. It's simply that he knew that he could say anything, no matter how untrue. And when people pointed out, look, here is the proof, for instance, that Obama was born an American. He just, well, I believe this, you can believe that.
Yes. And it's disturbing to hear people say, let alone a presidential candidate or someone of any relevance that people listen to, say, I don't care about facts. And you're entitled to your opinions. You're not entitled to your own facts.
Well, exactly. And you see, I'm quite convinced, and many people are like me, and it's a bit, of course, sort of shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted, as they say. But here in England, a year ago, even from now, a year ago, no sensible person believed that the British would vote to leave the European Union. Not because the European Union is a thing created by God or the Buddha or so wonderful or anything, but the consequences of leaving are so disastrous. And nobody thought we could possibly, if we had a vote, decide in any but one way. But then we got a few leaders, notably a man who'd just been mayor of London called Boris Johnson, a very well-educated, semi-aristocratic person. And it's hardly an exaggeration to say that every time he opened his mouth, he told a lie. And many very important things he lied about again and again and again and again. Now, the BBC, which sort of is the main medium in England, apart from some newspapers, but through radio and television actually reaches and influences far more people than all the newspapers put together. The BBC had a rule of impartiality. That was what they were given their license for, that you must not take one side or another politically. They interpreted this, and I think they do to this day, as saying, well, if Boris Johnson says we are paying, I don't remember the figure, but some extraordinary thing, something like we are paying £3 million a week to the European Union, for which we get nothing. And somebody else says, no, that's not true, and the Treasury has produced the real figures, and it's a small fraction of that. But they simply report both those statements.
And that's like letting the kids decide if evolution is true or not.
Yes, but this is, I've lived through months of this agony, seeing this. And they often, just the other day, they interviewed some old man in the Midwest in America who was still running the campaign office for Trump, even though the campaign is over. And they said to this perfectly amiable old gentleman, why do you support Donald Trump? And he said, well, because he's somebody who started with nothing and became a billionaire. And we all know that that is completely untrue.
Mm-hmm.
But the interviewer didn't say, but excuse me, that isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
They just go on to the next item.
Right.
And I think this is a very, very serious matter which affects us today, tomorrow. It's really happening all the time now.
Mm-hmm.
That the people who are in authority and could say, well, you know, one or two things that you said may be true or may not be true, but most of the things you said most certainly are not true. The facts and so on. I think that's their responsibility, not to report every damn lie,
right,
as if it had equal validity, just because somebody said it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really serious. And I don't for a moment accuse the Christians of being untruthful and so on, but I don't think the Christians, but I'm also saying I don't think the Buddhists are making enough fuss about this.
Right.
I think that people should really do something more active to promote the speaking of truth and condemn the speaking of deliberate falsehoods.
Yeah.
And I mean, most of these lies, you said, well, sometimes they're mistaken. Yes, but in most of the really important cases I'm talking about, I don't think they're mistaken. I think they're doing it deliberately.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing more of, and I'm noticing this in social media in particular, less so the popular media, which is disheartening, that there is an increase in activism and not just a light touch of saying, oh, tisk, tisk, what I'm seeing is bad, and then moving on and having your tea, but rather people getting a bit more actively engaged with some of the problems that you're bringing up. And I'm wondering if that's something you would like to see more happen, or what else you'd like to see happen with contemporary Buddhism. How can that help influence the society that we're living in?
I think it's extreme. No, I'm going to give a disappointing answer in a way, because I think that once people have reached adulthood and are full members of society, it's very difficult to get them to change their ways.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this really is a matter of education. We've got to really get a grip on schools and make teachers insist to pupils that the most important thing is to tell the truth, and to tell the truth to yourself. You know, the Pali course that I give is a very strange course in a way. I begin by making a sort of confession. And I say I have to make a confession, because half the point of this Pali course is not to teach you Pali. It's to teach you about the value of truth and what education and learning are about. And this has many ramifications, even in a Pali course. You know, when I had to teach at Princeton 20 years ago for a term, I actually wrote a letter to the authorities in Princeton saying that I was morally nauseated by what they called their honor code. It's not quite the same thing as telling the truth. But you probably know that the honor code in Princeton, which is followed by many other universities, is that if you, as a student there, or anybody else, suspect that somebody has indulged in some kind of plagiarism, and they interpret that very widely, you are honor bound to tell the authorities that they have cheated. Now, that is not how I see the application of truth at all. And I say to the students, firstly, when you do an elementary Pali exercise and say a sentence from English into Pali, I don't care how you get the right answer. You can discuss it with your friends. In fact, it's a very good way of doing it. And reach the right answer, because the guy sitting on your right, who you reckon is pretty clever, tells you it's this way. If he can explain to you why it is that way, you follow him. It doesn't matter if you get it from a person, it doesn't matter if you got it from a book, and it doesn't matter if you got it from a dream. The thing is to know how you got to know it and say it the way you think it is. That's all that matters. We get muddled about this in so many contexts. I mentioned a little earlier how the Oxford examination system is that at the end of a fixed period of learning, you are given a very long and arduous written examination in what you're supposed to have learned. But this examination, shall we say, takes place in the third week of June. And then you are given a grade which stays with you for the rest of your life. Oh, he got a first in Oxford, or his life was ruined because he failed to get a first in Oxford or something. Suppose he were allowed to sit that examination a month later, or whenever he chose, in fact, the same examination. Does it make the slightest difference on what day he got it right? Perhaps he was ill that day. Perhaps he'd been up all night tending to somebody who was very ill themselves. There are so many possibilities. If we think it important that somebody knows something, we don't put a date on it. So if it is very important that drivers have a certain, drivers of motor vehicles attain a certain standard, but if you fail a driving test, you can take it again, in Britain at least, any number of times until you pass it. So what is all this rubbish about this, this formalized idea of what it is to learn something, that you're allowed to look at certain books but not others. You're allowed to ask certain people, like your teacher, but not others, like your fellow students. You're allowed to do this, allowed to do that, etc. All that you have to focus on is the truth. And if you can get the truth from a source, get it from that source. And don't bother about what people say about that. And similarly, of course, the point I was making about the honor code wasn't merely about that, but why should you be told that if you find that what officialdom says is something wrong, is being done by a fellow student, you should report him? Is there no idea of human solidarity anymore? That takes us back to your thing about individualism in America, you see. It's individualism in competition.
Right.
And I say to my students, learning Pali is not a competition. I said, it makes no difference whatsoever whether you get through the exercise faster than somebody else. It doesn't matter how long you take. And in fact, when I begin setting them exercise, I say, don't hurry. It doesn't matter how fast you do it, and it certainly doesn't matter how fast other people do it. The point is simply to get it right.
Well, and there's so many additional benefits to having that learning process be a collaborative one.
Yes, exactly. So it's your responsibility, but that doesn't mean to say it's your responsibility not to communicate with your fellow men.
So you're still teaching Pali, but are you exclusively doing it online now? Or are you doing some traveling? Tell us about that.
Well, on the 27th of December, today, what is it? It's the 11th of December. On the 27th of December, I am flying to Bombay, and I shall be at a tourist resort between Bombay and Pune in Maharashtra for 3 weeks, giving my elementary course to selected students, selected for me by the lady who teaches Pali in Bombay University and has been doing so for many years. And the aim is firstly the usual one of teaching Pali to 15 students. That's about the number I usually accept on an elementary course, because if I have too many, they can't get the individual attention, which I think is essential. But it's also to translate the whole course into Marathi. And we're making a systematic, very serious attempt to translate the course into Marathi. As I can only stay for the 3 weeks, I don't think we shall complete the work in the 3 weeks, but I think we can make a very considerable start. Perhaps we could more than half of it. And then, if it's going all right, and I've got the right vocabulary, of course I don't know Marathi, you understand. They are people whose mother tongue is Marathi, but I'm there, I shall be together with people whose mother tongue is Marathi, but who know English well. And then it'll be in Marathi. And Marathi is the language I've chosen because it's the mother tongue of 9 million people approximately in that part of India. Follow Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, which is, as you know, a variant of Theravada Buddhism. But they've got no access to the Pali texts. None. And they really don't, they know almost nothing about Buddhism. But this will enable them. And if it goes well, I already have plans underway to do roughly the same for Chinese. We're not just there dealing with 9 million people, we're dealing with like 9,000 billion people. I'm told again and again that there are lots of people in China now who are interested in early Buddhism and would like to learn Pali, but they have virtually no opportunity to do so. And this may be very difficult, but I'm going to try to get the course translated into Chinese. I have the same problem, of course, as I have with Marathi, that I don't know any Chinese. And I will have to rely very much on certain people. And my efforts at the moment are going into finding people whom I can trust to help me. Not only people who are keen on Buddhism and have goodwill and so on. And it's essential that they have good English, which is often difficult to find. But people who have good English and good Chinese, and they would probably be people whose mother tongue is Chinese, and will translate it in a way that makes sense into China. Instead of having, we still have in our English language Buddhism expressions which really don't make very much sense. I don't want to say that seeing things as they are doesn't make sense, but it's not awfully informative.
Right.
But what are the 5 aggregates? Now that's really ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense at all. So what I want of a translation is that it should actually mean something. And I'd rather have it sometimes make a mistake in meaning something than mean nothing at all. Because meaning nothing at all is saying to the people who receive this teaching, yes, I know this sounds like mumbo jumbo, but just accept it anyway.
Well, that's a good segue to if there's a quote or a word or a passage from the Pali Canon that people commonly misunderstand.
Yes. And sometimes, I mean, unfortunately, especially when she got quite old, the person who was president of the Pali Text Society for many years, Miss Isabel B. Horner, she got into the way of writing in English. I find it easier to understand the Pali than to understand her English translations of the Pali, which are so contorted. You know, they don't really follow the rules of English syntax. They try to follow Pali syntax. And this is just so stupid. And it's also, I think, very deplorable to say, well, we have no English word equivalent to deva, so let's leave it in the Pali and call it deva. No, that won't do. You've got to choose an English word so that you can read it as an English sentence. And you have a footnote or some form of explanation at the beginning saying that of course, the word God is used in a different culture, quite differently from how it's used in a culture with a Christian background. And the same goes for soul, of course. For instance, it's just something. Firstly, nobody in our culture agrees what a soul is anyway. And so when I was teaching pupils at Oxford University, about week 5 or week 6 of the term, I would give them the essay on Anatmavada or Anattata, the doctrine of no soul. They would come in with their essays, which they were going to read to me. I said, before we begin, you're going to talk about no soul, but can you tell me what is being negative? What is a soul? And then they would look unhappy. Stressed. I say, well, look, if I said it's a teaching of no no's, we would recognize if somebody had no nose, and there would be universal agreement about what the nose was. Is there any such agreement about the soul? What do your teachers say? Well, sir, we've never had a lecture on this. So I wrote to the theology faculty, and I said, I'm depressed to learn that your students who learn theology are never given a lecture on the soul.
I'm sure you made a lot of friends out of that note.
Well, that's quite nice. And they replied quite well and said, well, this is, yes, you put your finger on a great problem that we have. We don't agree. But anyway, that's really, I want to apply that to translation. I think we must produce translations of the Pali Canon, which have a meaning in English. And it's not possible always to produce a translation which has no footnotes or other forms of expansion, something in square brackets or whatever. Because languages are different, and they're different because cultures are different, and you have to explain this to people. So I think there's a lot of good to be done there, waiting to be done. I'm very happy to read, incidentally, perhaps you know this, that the Venerable Sujatu is translating the four Nikayas.
Yes.
Well, that's very good news.
I'm eager to see that because he's a very intelligent fellow. I think certainly his heart's in the right place, and he's someone who I think has a broad perspective on how a tradition might have some challenges in today's society.
Sure. Yes.
Professor, is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Well, I will tell you one thing that's come across my desk, so to speak, rather recently, and that is, although I'm not with him absolutely 100% on every point, how can one be? I'm a great admirer of the Venerable Analayu and what he is doing, especially because of his not only knowing Pali very well by now, but having studied Chinese and his being able to consult the Chinese versions of texts, which I think is wonderful. And you know that, I'll just get it for you. I think where is it? Well, he's just published a book. I was going to hold it up, but got it right here.
He's take a look.
Published a book on the foundation of the nuns' order, the order of bhikshunis, of Buddhist nuns. And I think he has proved absolutely conclusively that the whole story of the Buddhas being unwilling or very reluctant to ordain nuns and creating extra rules therefore and saying that the sasana, Buddhism on earth, would only last half as long and so on. All this is a late forgery and there is no truth in it whatsoever. And indeed, it would contradict so many fundamental things about the Buddha's teaching and his attitude towards women, that it's always been a terrible fly in the ointment. If we say that the Buddha was so tolerant, egalitarian, and so on, how can we claim that he had that attitude about women becoming nuns? And the answer is that we were wrong, and he never did hold that attitude. That's the main point, but there's a very big second point, which isn't in this book, but I've made in public at times, and that is that the dying out of the order of nuns, the Theravada Bhikkhuni order, which probably took place just about 1,000 years ago, pretty exactly, although we can never be very precise about it. This is due to the fact that when a nun is ordained, she has to be ordained by both monks and nuns, and if there are no nuns, that can't happen. But as you may know, one of the three great obstacles to spiritual progress, according to the Buddha, is something called Silabbata Paramaso, which means attachment to ritual, and thinking that ritual matters. This is purely a matter of ritual. And therefore it was simply one of the three great impediments to spiritual progress, and that's all there is to it.
And one of the things that's first released upon one's progress is attachment and adherence to rites.
Unfortunately, most Buddhists haven't reacted in that way.
Right.
So the excuse that you can't have any nuns now because there are no nuns to ordain them is ludicrous and entirely unworthy of sincere Buddhists. And I think that how are we to get this word out to the Theravada countries, which are so conservative, and unwilling to accept that anything new could be found out. Of course, we're not finding out anything new in any radical sense. We're simply saying that this text is a complete misinterpretation. And I think that Theravada Buddhism is in steep decline, and a major reason for its steep decline is its attitude to women in general, and in particular to the ordination of women. And, I think that our sisters in the Western world, quite rightly, are not having any of it. And if they want to become Buddhists, they go to the Mahayana traditions on the whole. And I think that Theravada, if it is committing suicide slowly, it's strangling itself by this. And they'd better do something about it. But I can't say that I'm optimistic, because the freedom of thought, or the willingness to think new thoughts in Theravada countries, is at a very, very low point indeed. So I think that's very important, very urgent. That's one of the things that is to be gained, I suppose, by spreading knowledge of Pali as far as we can. But at the same time, when I spread the knowledge of Pali, I also tell them to read Analeo's new book, if they can get it. Well, they will get hold of it.
And in fact, for folks who are listening to this episode, I'll make a point of including that in the list of books that are on the episode page for this episode, along with Professor Gombrich's and a few others that we've mentioned here. Our guest today, Professor Richard Gombrich, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate this dialogue. I suspect we may be inviting you back again to unpack some of these topics we've only lightly touched a little bit more. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to air my views on which I feel very, very passionately. And I don't think I've got very much time left. And therefore, I very much welcome the chance to talk to you, and thank you for your kindness and your interview. So goodbye for now, and all the best to everybody who's listening.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.